So 63 people.
Exacto, se nos va. Bueno, buenos días a todas y a todos. A todas y a todas, a todos y a todos, perdón. Estamos en un nuevo curso, yo sigo publicando aquí un poco en el formato híbrido y hoy ha venido con nosotros profesor Erickson, que lo va a presentar nuestro compañero Fran Ortega, que está en la Facultad de Ciencias de la Actividad Física y el Deporte. Y bueno, es un visiting scholar suyo que está aquí en la Universidad de Granada trabajando con él. Y ya sabéis que el curso nos va a dar una serie de tips o una serie de consejos para la petición de proyectos, sobre todo en un contexto de carácter internacional, ¿vale? No me quiero entretener mucho, le voy a dar la palabra directamente a Fran Ortega, que conoce bien el perfil. Yo simplemente thank you for stay here and participate y yo sigo publicando. Thank you very much. So, Fran,
vale. Muchas gracias, Dani. Voy a decir unas 2 o 3 palabras en español y luego paso al inglés. Realmente es un placer presentar hoy a Kirk Erickson. Es un profesor de la Universidad de Pittsburgh, que originalmente su formación es en psicología y se ha especializado en neurociencias. Concretamente es uno de los líderes mundiales en el área de ejercicio y neurociencia o cerebro, cognición. Y bueno, tiene artículos referentes en Nature Review, Neuroscience y también en Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Y en fin, ha sido la persona que ha dirigido el grupo de trabajo de Brain Health en las Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans. Pero en realidad la charla de hoy no va sobre su línea central de trabajo, sino va sobre consejos para pedir proyectos y para que nos los financien, ¿no? Y bueno, nosotros estás de Visiting Professor en la Universidad de Granada gracias al programa del plan propio y bueno, está con el Centro de Cerebro y Comportamiento, con Andrés Catena, nosotros también colaboramos con él y creíamos que era una pena que solo nosotros podíamos beneficiarnos de la experiencia, la grandísima experiencia que tiene solicitando proyectos y por tanto pensamos en abrirlo a toda la comunidad universitaria para que esperamos que os resulte de interés. Just a few words in English. Thanks a lot, Kirk, for accepting this invitation. We told him actually that it would be a pity if after several months of the University of Granada, we could not have a discussion with him on how to do better project applications. Actually, if just to put it into context, he, in the NIH, in the National Institute of Health, is the main funding body in the USA. A very large, major grant is about $3 million. Obviously, it's much more than what we are used to here in the Mineco or in the PAIDI, right? That is about 100,000 euros. But even there, as I say, a major grant is 3 million euros. So, but Kirk actually obtained a project funded for $30 million. And in addition to that project funded with $30 million, he got another grants that altogether sum up $50 million in a period of time. So he has been extremely successful applicant. And in addition, he is actually a reviewer member of the NIH for many grant applications. So he has the view for the applicant and for the reviewer. So as I say, I think it's really an opportunity, it's an honor, and we are really looking forward to hear some of his tips, suggestions for applying for funding in a better way. So, Kirk, thank you very much for accepting this invitation and yeah, I will go down actually.
Okay.
Sure.
70 people in the virtual room.
It's okay, Danny, sharing?
It's okay. We can see.
Good.
También puedes modo presentación y luego la anotación. En modo presentación. Voy a cambiar de base. Un momento.
Okay, so
¿No?
Ahora.
Claro, pero ahora no.
Ahora voy a trabajar en la pantalla la nota. Ahora seguimos. Ahora no. No veo nada. Ahora.
we're good?
It's okay.
We're good? All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. Hope that you're all staying safe and healthy. Of course, it's sometimes a bit difficult in these contexts to ask questions, but feel free to do so. And if you don't feel comfortable asking a question, I am here in Granada for at least the next several months. So feel free to reach out to me. I'm here to contribute and participate and talk to everyone. So really happy to be here. Over the last several months, I've had just a fantastic time. It's been such a productive and at the same time fun and engaging several months. So thank you, Fran, for the very kind introduction. It's exciting for me to be talking about something other than my science, actually, to give a slightly different type of talk than what I'm used to. As Fran mentioned a bit about my background and experiences, I thought I would present here, also put on the screen some of the experiences that I've had that maybe provide some context for why I'm giving this talk today. So I've been involved with 19 fellowships that have been successfully awarded from 10 different graduate students in my research group. We've received 8 fellowships for postdoctoral researchers. And as Fran mentioned earlier, we've received over $50 million in NIH grant support in the last 5 years over several institutes, including aging, heart, lung, and blood, cancer, and diabetes. And in addition, over the last 10 years, I've been involved with grants coming from other organizations, including the Alzheimer's Association, the Spanish Ministry, the Australian Research Council, Dementia, Australia Research Foundation, Canadian Institutes of Health Research, amongst others. But besides these successes in achieving or obtaining grant supports, I've been a grant reviewer, and this has provided me with some important insights on how grants are reviewed, what people who are reviewing grants typically want to see or think about as they're reading them. I've been a standing member of an NIH study section just until recently, until I actually came here in 2021. And I've also been an ad hoc reviewer for numerous organizations and foundations around the world. And generally, I act as a reviewer for somewhere between 40 and 50 grants per year. Now, there are different ways of thinking about grants. I've roughly divided them into 3 classifications here. One we can think of as fellowship applications, and that's a different type of application than a more standard scientific application in which you're proposing to conduct a specific study or series of studies. And then in addition, I have a third classification on here, which I refer to as moonshot applications. And what I mean by that will become a little bit clearer later on in the presentation, but it's basically an application in which you're shooting for the moon. You're trying to do something almost revolutionary. And that maybe can be classified as a third type of grant. And there's others. This is just my own general way of thinking about the types of grants that can be submitted. So I think when you first start thinking about a grant that you want to be submitting, either a fellowship, a standard scientific application, or a moonshot, it's important to think like a reviewer. And so how does a reviewer think? In other words, when I act as a reviewer and I'm opening up a grant, what are some important considerations to have in mind? Or similarly, as I'm writing a grant, what are the things that I need to be thinking about from a reviewer, what a reviewer might be in a position or be handling or managing when thinking and reviewing my grant? So first of all, it's important to know that generally your grants are reviewed by scientists, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the scientific reviewer is a specialist in your area. I review grants from many different scientific disciplines. And so if you go in writing a grant assuming that your reviewer is going to know the language, the lingo, the terminology, the background, you are making a mistake. So first of all, assume that your scientific reviewer is a scientist, but doesn't necessarily know the area very well. The other thing to keep in mind is that these scientific reviewers have other jobs other than reviewing your grant, which means that they are typically very busy individuals. They're probably managing their own laboratories. They're probably trying to write their own grant applications and maybe reviewing other grant applications. This means that they have limited time. The more time that I have to spend reading a grant application, the more likely it is to be less likely it is to be funded. If it's taken me a lot of time to go through your application, that's a problem. And so you want to be able to make it easy for the reviewer to read your application. And so keep in mind that these people are busy individuals. They don't have a lot of time to go and do their own research to try to understand your application. Their brains might be on fire because they are likely reviewing a lot of other grants at the same time they're reviewing your grant. So typically I might be reviewing 5, 10, maybe even more grant applications in a particular grant cycle, which means that I've got a lot of science running through my head. I've already seen a lot of figures, a lot of backgrounds, a lot of theories for other grants. So this is something also important to keep in mind. The more scientific lingo, the more acronyms, the harder your grant is to read, the more difficult it is to distinguish your grant from all of the other grants that have been read. What I'm looking for is a grant that stands out, that's easy to read, that I can make sense of, and that stands out on its own. Also, make an assumption that your grant reviewer is both tired and a bit grumpy, because they've got a lot of work to do. They're trying to manage a lot of things. Again, make it easy on them. A fun application, a grant application that's fun for me to read is more likely to get a better score from me, okay? The other good advice that I want to provide to you is make an assumption that your application is actually being reviewed on a red-eye cross-Atlantic flight with a glass of wine in their hand. In other words, they're not reviewing your grant application in a perfectly quiet environment without any distractions. They're probably tired, they're busy, they're distracted, and they're reviewing other grants, and they might be on a red-eye flight overnight while they're drinking some wine. So keep in mind that these things are probably happening while they are reviewing your grant application. So what else is the reviewer thinking? More from a scientific perspective, what kinds of things are they looking for? One of the first things that comes to my mind, and as I look through and as I'm reading an application, is how feasible is the project? That's one of the first things. I'm proposing a project that would require so much effort to do, require so much money, or so many resources that, given the time frame, the type of participants, the type of project, the type of techniques, what they're trying to do, if it's not feasible, if I don't think that this project is feasible, then your project isn't getting funded. I'm not going to be scoring your project high. So it has to be feasible. You have to be able to demonstrate that you could actually do it. This seems like something very straightforward, and that's something everyone should be not knowing already before you put in your grant application. But I actually read a lot of grant applications where it's not clear to me that the project is actually feasible. This comes back to expertise, right? The more expertise you have in an area, the more likely you are to understand that this project is feasible or is not feasible, which means that I'm looking for expertise. Do they have the expertise? Does this team have the expertise to actually conduct this project? And so I'm looking for hints, and maybe not even just hints, maybe even very explicit information that this team, these people have the qualifications and the expertise to execute this project successfully. Also, I want to know, what are the gaps in knowledge that are trying to be addressed? I'm going to elaborate a bit on this in just a minute here, but a lot of applications, it's not clear to me as a reviewer. And again, I'm reviewing applications that I'm not the scientific expertise. I don't know the area all that well. So I am reading the grant application. I'm not a scientist in this specific area, so it's not clear to me what are the gaps in knowledge that are really trying to be addressed. Significance and innovation. If you want your grant to stand on its own, separate, and to separate itself from other grants in this cycle or other grants that I'm reviewing, you need to be very clear about the significance of your application and innovation. I'm going to get to this more in just a minute as well. Pitfalls. It's always good if you point out the pitfalls before the reviewer points them out for you. If you know what the pitfalls are in your application, you can address them up front, and you can address them in a way that you can say, look, I don't think that this is a major pitfall, or I have addressed this, or I have weighed all of these things, and I think that this is a pitfall, but in the next study that we do, we can address this. So addressing pitfalls and acknowledging the pitfalls of any application, and any application has pitfalls. So don't think that your application is free from pitfalls or weaknesses, because every application has them. And then also next steps. A reviewer has to know, what direction is this field going in? You don't want the reviewer to think, well, this is the final application. Once they get results from this study, there's no further way that they can go. You don't want the reviewer thinking that way. You want the reviewer to understand that there's a lot of other directions that this line of research can go in. So here are some general guidelines. When you're writing a grant, to be prepared for. One is that grants take a significant amount of time. So do not procrastinate. Do not wait until the last minute in order to get them, to get the ideas and material on paper. Generally, at least several months. Sometimes I start working on the ideas and the methodology and the materials a whole year, actually, before I submit it. So it takes a long time. Also, you need to consider institutional delays and needs. At least at my institution at the University of Pittsburgh, I need to submit the grant a couple of weeks before it's actually due. So just because an institution or a foundation or a funding institution has a deadline, doesn't mean that you have until that deadline to submit the grant. Typically, institutions need your material several weeks in advance. Also, consider time needed for helpful advice and editing. So for an example, if I get asked to review a grant, if you email me and say, Kirk, I would really love for you to review my grant and provide me edits, it's due next week. I'm sorry, but I probably don't have time to review your grant thoroughly and provide you feedback in enough time that you can address my comments and submit your grant proposal. Which means that if you want me to review your grant and provide some helpful feedback, it has to be at least several weeks in advance. Another key point here, another tip, is don't allow reviewers to make assumptions. So you really be direct and as explicit as possible. I'm going to go through a few examples here in a minute for what I mean by this. But once you start allowing your reviewers to make assumptions about the significant innovation, your aims, hypotheses, then you have started to lose your reviewer. So do not allow your reviewers to make assumptions. Be direct and as explicit as possible. Coming back to my comment that most likely your reviewer is being distracted or drinking wine on a plane, be redundant. It's okay to have a bit of redundancy to remind your reviewer about what it is you're trying to accomplish. And don't let the reviewer infer what is significant and innovative. And this comes back to not allowing them to just simply make assumptions about your grant. Another point that I have to make a comment on, especially to junior investigators, is grants are not a time to be modest about your successes. In fact, it's a time to actually brag a bit about all of your accomplishments, the successes that you've had in either getting additional grants, doing your research, your publications, your publication history, the people that you've worked with. It's not a time to be modest. Make sure your reviewers understand that you are qualified to produce and participate in this research. Identify the gaps that your proposal will address. I'm going to come back to this in just a second, but make sure that you identify the gaps. This is a major error that I see a lot of, especially junior investigators, making, where I have to start making some inferences or guesses about where the gaps are. Again, you've kind of lost me as a reviewer at that point. Be reasonable with respect to the time frame of the project. If you're submitting a 3-year project, a 1-year project, a 5-year project, make sure that you are thinking about the time frame, when things are going to be executed, how quickly things are going to be done, the feasibility of the project, your budget. Don't say that you're going to collect 1 million people when you only have the budget for 100. And expertise. So really can always be thinking about these things as you are putting together the science. So here's where we're getting to the gaps in knowledge. Let me take a step back. I've mentioned this a few times now and give you a few examples and why this is actually so difficult, but so important as well. I think of this as a bit of a balancing act because you want to be able to provide justification for your aims. You want to be able to say that there is a lot of theory and background and prior literature to support the aims and hypotheses that you have. But at the same time, you need to say that there are gaps in the literature, that things are missing, right? So this is a balancing act. You need to provide enough theory to lead the reviewer to understand what the gaps actually are. Let me provide a couple of slides here to give you a sense of how to write an application maybe in a not so good way and then in a better way. And I'm going to give you a few examples here. So over the next few slides. And here's a sentence that at first glance might be a perfectly reasonable sentence, especially from a scientist like ourselves who are trained to be skeptical. Research has shown that exercise might improve brain health. That's a true statement. And as a scientist, I would mostly agree with that. I think that we should remain skeptical and be direct with some of our statements like this. And so this is a true statement. However, it doesn't really show a lot of confidence. It's not a very confident statement, especially if you're trying to indicate to the reviewer that this is something that we want to almost take for granted. This isn't necessarily the question that we're asking, We want the reviewer to go in with a little bit more confidence. Well, we can change around some of the wording in this. Research suggests that exercise is capable of improving brain health. That's another way of basically saying the same thing here. But this also, the word suggests doesn't really give me a lot of confidence. If I'm reading this as a naive reviewer, I don't know this area. This doesn't give me a lot of confidence. How about this sentence? I've just changed the same sentence to read a little bit differently. Our research indicates that exercise can improve brain health. So here now I've moved from capable of to it can, which is a slight difference. The change from suggests to indicates. The word indicates has a slightly stronger connotation. We have a bit more evidence is what I'm saying here, right? To support this claim. And I'm also using the word our research. I've now put our expertise, my expertise in the context of the sentence. I'm not saying that the field in general has found support for this. I'm saying that our research has contributed to this area of research to make this claim. Here's another sentence, another way of saying something like this. Our research demonstrates that exercise improves brain health. Now I've removed that word can or capable of. I'm saying that our research has demonstrated. This is a much more confident and direct way of making this statement. The reviewer, especially a reviewer who may know this area a little bit, but is really relying on me as the expert, now they're coming at this saying, okay, this we can be more confident that research in general has demonstrated that this is actually true. Here's another final way that I might throw out there, and this is probably the way that I tend to prefer. Exercise improves brain health, period. I don't want the reviewers to question that statement, right? I'm not allowing the reviewer to question that statement. I'm leading the reviewer to a conclusion. This door has shut. We know that exercise improves brain health. For example, our research has unequivocally demonstrated that exercise enhances da-da-da-da-da. Okay, so this is a different framing of the exact same sentences that I've written above. So this is now crafting what is known, okay? Crafting what is known. I'm not yet addressing what the gaps are in our knowledge. What is that? What actually is this application really trying to address? So here's an example. Now, example number 1 here, let me just read this. Exercise enhances numerous measures of brain health, including cerebrovascular and morphological characteristics. This has been shown in children and adults and in populations with psychological and cognitive impairments. Sounds pretty good so far, right? The next sentence, our aim is to test the impact of exercise on brain health in adults with mild cognitive impairment. Now, as a reviewer, I would look at this and I would say, but wait a second, what is the gap that is trying to be addressed here? You just indicated what is known in the first 2 sentences. It seems to me that we already know that exercise influences brain health. Why would we think that exercise doesn't influence brain health in people with mild cognitive impairment? It's not clear to me as a reviewer why your aim is this particular aim. So let's change this very slightly. I've kept the first 2 sentences the same, but now I've underlined the section that I've added here. Unfortunately, we still have a very poor understanding of the impact of exercise on brain health in individuals at the greatest risk of developing dementia. So here now, I've told you very explicitly where we have a poor understanding. We know the first 2 sentences, right? I've been fairly straightforward with the first 2 sentences, but the next sentence, I'm telling you where our gap in knowledge is. And then I'm telling you the implication of that gap. Such a gap in knowledge limits the use of exercise as a therapeutic approach in this population. So that's the implication of this gap in knowledge. Then I say explicitly, Our aim is to address this gap in knowledge. I am not allowing the reviewer to make any inferences about what we are trying to do. I am telling them directly what we are trying to test in this application. So the construction of these sentences has to be thought out very carefully. What do you want the reviewer to really know and not question? What do you want the reviewer to understand? What is the gap in knowledge? And what is the implication of that gap? What are we being held up in achieving by not having this information? So this comes to the aims and hypotheses. First of all, the aims and hypotheses should proceed logically from the background and description of what is known and what are the gaps in knowledge that you've identified. So be very specific and do not be afraid to indicate the direction of your hypotheses. The more vague you are, the more questions the reviewer might have about what's actually being hypothesized here. You have to question, do the aims and hypotheses build on top of one another? And if not, then how do they connect with one another? So if you might have 3 different aims, how does aim 3 relate back to aim 1 or aim 2? If they do build on top of one another, can you be confident that aim 3 can actually be tested if aim 1 fails? And if so, then you need to clearly articulate how aim 3 can be still tested. It's also important to indicate what is your primary aim here with this application, what aims might be secondary, and what aims might be entirely exploratory. So let's go into some examples like I just did with the previous example with gaps in knowledge. So here are 3 aims from a grant application that I submitted and got funding for a number of years ago. You can see that there's 3 aims, and I've underlined here a few things that I want to focus your attention to. First of all, with aim 1 and aim 2, I use the word examine. I'm not using the word explore. The word explore has a connotation that I don't really know exactly what I'm looking for. I'm exploring, right? The word examine is very direct. I am examining this particular aim. So you can also see that I've highlighted H1, which means that I have a particular hypothesis with this particular aim. H1, you can see that I've shortened it to H1, right? The reviewer is generally smart enough to understand that by H1, I'm meaning my hypothesis. And notice how specific I've gotten. I'm not saying that I'm not testing, or my hypothesis isn't that exercise just improves cognition broadly. I am specifying specific areas of cognition that I think are going to be effective. Aim 2 is the same way, although aim 2 is a little bit more broad. You can see that I'm specifying that I think my intervention is going to increase particular aspects of brain function and brain health in particular areas, prefrontal and hippocampal areas. Aim 3, that is where I use the word explore, because now the reviewers can say, oh, okay, this aim is a little bit more exploratory. So if there's not a very specific hypothesis about this, it's more acceptable. I still use the word examine, but you can see the breadth of this particular aim. I don't have as much details. I basically am saying, we're going to look at a whole bunch of different things with the data that we're collecting. And notice that last part, mediate improvements in cognitive performance. What I just did there is I related aim 3 back to aim 1. So now my aims are somewhat integrated. I've got memory and cognitive function in aim 1. I've got the brain regions that are likely subserving those areas in aim 2. And aim 3, I'm trying to examine potential mediators for the cognitive effects in aim 1. So they aren't dependent on one another. They're separate, but yet they're still interconnected. So as we think about constructing a grant proposal, and you can notice already, I'm not focusing on the science. I'm focusing on the grantsmanship. Significance and innovation also plays a very big role. Now, we can think about significance in a number of ways. A lot of reviewers think about significance from a scientific perspective. What is the scientific significance? How would this grant proposal move the science forward in a meaningful way? We could also think about significance from a public health perspective. What are the public health significance, the potential public health significance from your application? We could think about significance from a policy perspective. What are the potential policies that could come from the results from your grant application? Or simply the novelty of it. This provides a completely novel direction of research. And so you can think about significance from a number of perspectives. Innovation typically comes with the word new methodology that you've been trying to develop, a new idea that you're trying to test, a new technology that you're trying to implement, either in the context of just general new technology or in the context of a new idea. Maybe it's a new approach, maybe a new analytical approach, new analytics or statistics that you might be wanting to apply. So think about innovation from a very broad perspective. What has the field been somewhat missing? Where are you taking the field next with your application? Think about it broadly. It doesn't just have to be a new technology. It can be a new analytical approach that could shed new light on this important question. So let's take a look at some key terms and phrases to consider. For the first time, we will be able to test. The results from this research could potentially transform this field. Our innovative use of technology to address our aims. Our proposal reflects a cost-effective approach for addressing this major public health problem. Our highly productive team is well positioned. The outcomes of this work could have far-reaching scientific and public health implications. So you can see I've outlined and underlined some key terms that are highly relevant and really sting the reviewer. Again, think about the reviewer not having a lot of time, new to this area. They want to know what's significant and what's innovative. They don't want to make inferences about that. They want you to tell them what is significant and what is innovative. So let's look at it as an example here. This is a lot of text. I don't want you to get worried about so much text here. But let me go through this, and I've highlighted and underlined here some key terms. Now, this is coming from the same grant that I showed you before with the aims, from a successful grant application. Our primary goal is to conduct a study that will transform scientific-based policy and healthcare recommendations for improving cognitive function and reducing health disparities. We have assembled a highly productive and interdisciplinary team with a long history of conducting this type of research to provide answers to important unsettled scientific questions that have critical public health consequences. Notice that I'm being redundant. I said earlier, it's important, it's okay to be redundant. I've already been redundant here in the first few sentences, right? I'm reminding the reviewer in a few different ways that this application has public health implications. Ours will be the first study of its kind. It's highly innovative and will add to the scientific literature. Now I've italicized, I've numbered, and I've said explicitly, for the first time, we will examine. I'm, again, not allowing the reviewer to really make inferences about the significance and innovation here. Skipping down a little bit, hence there is an immediate need to expand these results to minority and more vulnerable populations. So I'm being very explicit. There is an immediate need. Number two, we will examine whether African dance is effective. I'm using the word cutting edge MRI sequences and analytical approaches. I'm not just using MRI. I'm not just using statistics or analyses. I'm using cutting edge MRI sequences. Number 3, for the first time, I use that phrase again, for the first time, we will examine whether increasing physical activity through African dance could serve as a platform to assess health disparities. What that is telling the reviewer is that this isn't a stop. It's not just that we're going to do this research and then stop. I'm going to use this as a platform to address other problems and other ways of addressing the problems with health disparities. As such, our innovative design could be molded into future interventions. Again, reviewers don't want to see that this research is just going to stop. What could be done? Could you point them in a direction saying that, yes, this field could have some new directions and some future directions to it. So I think this is a good example of how you can use the language. Again, there's very little science actually in this entire paragraph. It's all about the grantsmanship. It's about the terminology. It's about how you guide reviewers to thinking the way that you want them to think, which is the way you're thinking, right? Assembling a team. I said expertise earlier is so important. And assembling a team is incredibly important. And how you frame your biosketch is incredibly important. I'll give you an example here in just a minute, but you might want to, for my examples for biosketches, I might want to emphasize my cognitive neuroscience and psychology background, or I might want to emphasize the exercise neuroscience background. Don't assume that reviewers know who you are and what your expertise is. In fact, an anecdote, the first application that I ever submitted was not funded. And one of the reviewers came back, and one of their comments to me was that it was unclear who would be doing the neuroimaging work in my application. And at first, I have to admit, I got angry at that reviewer. It's easy to get angry at reviewers, right? I got angry at that reviewer. They should know that it was me that would be doing the neuroimaging research. That's my area of expertise. But then after a few days, I realized I was making an assumption about that reviewer. Why should that reviewer know anything about me? How should they know that I have the skill set to be able to analyze the neuroimaging data? So I should tell them then in my next grant very explicitly that I have the expertise, that my lab has the expertise to conduct the neuroimaging research that we've proposed to do in this application. Now, redundant expertise can be hazardous. It can be beneficial in some ways, but it can be hazardous in some other ways. Now, this can be difficult to manage because quite often the people that you know best are the people that are closest to your area. And so generally you want to include in a grant the people that you work well with and that are your colleagues, your close colleagues. But having too much redundant expertise can actually be a bad thing. As a reviewer, if I see 5 people that all have the same expertise, why do 5 people with the same expertise need to be on this application? Why is that? If it's not clear to me, that could be a major problem. You should also try to focus on special skills that can be complementary. So this person has this set of skills in maybe this area of statistics that this other person doesn't have. And so this person can complement the expertise that this person is carrying. So really make sure and highlight and describe, again, very explicitly to reviewers why these people have the expertise. Why have you selected these people to be on your team? Weaknesses of one person could be offset by the strengths of another. We all can't be specialists in everything. So really focus and emphasize that this person brings this expertise to your team. It's also sometimes good to have a range of senior and junior investigators. If there's an application that's all junior investigators with no seniority, sometimes that raises some concerns. Maybe there's not enough senior expertise to guide some of the projects and some of the potential problems. If it's all senior applicants or all senior people on the application, sometimes that can raise concerns. Do these people really have the time that's needed to dedicate to this particular project? The team should work well together. Highlight that you have a history of publishing together, working together, and so on. So here's an example. Again, I've highlighted a few words that you can focus on. I am a professor. I'm telling the reviewers who I am and that I'm not a junior person. I've reached a rank that is more senior. I was originally trained in experimental psychology. So I'm telling them where my original training is. I direct a laboratory. Okay, so I'm telling them now where my laboratory is, and I've highlighted number 1, number 2, number 3, that my laboratory can really kind of consists into 3 main groups of people. I'm telling them that I have expertise in randomized clinical trials. I'm telling them how many papers that I've been involved with publishing. I'm telling them about some of my leadership roles and responsibilities. A member of the 2000 Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee. It's a leadership position. I'm a principal investigator of other grants. I've been awarded a leadership award in a particular area. And then the last sentence, and you can frame this in a lot of different ways. It's very flexible, but look at the last sentence. I have worked closely with the members of this team on several projects, papers, and grants. And Dr. Stillman, who is the principal investigator of this particular proposal, Dr. Stillman and I have several ongoing projects funded together, meaning that we're not a naive team. If we know each other well. And this is important because, as some of you probably know, some people might be easier for you to work with than others. And that is key for a successful project. You want to work with people that you work well with. And reviewers want this grant to be successful, meaning that they want you to work with people who are also easy to work with. So make it clear that that's the case. Now, also, the budget is a really important key point of any grant application. And this comes back to one of the key elements that I mentioned right at the beginning, feasibility. If you are proposing to collect 1 million subjects when you have the budget to only collect 100, then that is a problem, right? That's a feasibility problem that, as a reviewer, I'm looking at and I'm thinking, there's no way that they can actually do this with the resources that they're asking for. Now, what I mean by that first bullet point, grant aims will dictate the budget, right? The more expensive things that you're trying to do, the more expensive techniques, the more assays, the more people that you're trying to collect, or the more rats or monkeys that you're trying to test, the longer the study, the more money and the more resources it's going to take to actually accomplish the aims that you're outlining in your proposal. The aims that you're outlining will dictate the budget, but if your grant foundation says, sorry, we have a top budget of $300,000, well, then that's going to end up dictating what you can actually do, right? So there's just limited resources. So you have to be thinking about the budget very early. You have to be thinking about what types of things that you could accomplish with the budget that you have, and they have to kind of feed off of one another. You can't necessarily let your science be dictated by the budget, but you can't just have aims that are not dictated by the budget, right? You have to have some back and forth. The aims have to be balanced with the money that you have available. I usually think of 3 main sections of any grant. What is the personnel needed? The staff, the students, the consultants, the investigators, the team. As you're constructing the team, how many people, how long do you need them? What kind of expertise do they need to have? Do they need to have PhDs? Can they be entry-level positions? What kind of expertise do they need? What are the supplies and equipment that you need? Computers, carts, assays. What are the implementation costs, the subject payments, the MRI costs of the MRI facilities, anything else that's needed to conduct the study. But there's other things that you should not forget. Publication costs. A lot of journals now require some sort of cost associated with publishing. You should be thinking about including those costs in the grant. What about traveling to meetings to be able to disseminate the results? Posters and other presentations. These are costs that you might need or might want to include in a grant application. Don't forget to include time, money, and resources for data management and analysis. Data management and analysis takes time. It takes computers, it takes expertise, it takes time to do, and people need to get a paycheck. They need to have some income. Otherwise, they're not going to be involved in your project. How do you budget for unanticipated costs? Now, by definition, unanticipated costs are difficult to budget because they're unanticipated. But at the same time, I can guarantee you that you will have unanticipated costs in your project. How do you go about balancing this? This is very difficult to do and can take some time negotiating with foundations, with your university or institution. And sometimes you might want to say, well, if something comes up that will cost me $10,000, where would I get that $10,000 from? Could I find it? Could I rebalance my budget to find some way of getting that money within the grant that I've gotten funded? One of the other points is developing the methodology. Now, methodology is often the easiest part of an application for reviewers to critique. So there's 5 questions to really ask yourself when you're writing a grant. Why this particular method and population? These are questions that reviewers are going to be asking. Why this particular method and application? What is the reason for the sample size? What is the planned statistical or analytical approach? What techniques and instruments are necessary for testing the aims? And what are the pitfalls and limitations? So you should really be thinking about addressing these particular aims right from the beginning as you're developing your application. The other thing to keep in mind is the aesthetic appeal. As I mentioned, grant reviewers are busy. The more dense an application is, the more difficult it is for them to read. Include figures, include breaks. Make titles and sections easy to see and discriminate from one section to another. And figures should be self-sustaining and not too complex. There's a lot of figures that you could add. Make them self-sufficient. For an example, these are 2 figures that I included in one of my grant applications. You don't need to read my grant in order to interpret what these figures are saying along with the captions. So the figure and captions speak for themselves. Make sure that the illustrations, the figures that you're including speak for themselves and are self-sufficient. Coming back to these grant applications then. We have fellowships, standard scientific applications, and moonshots. Fellowship applications really, again, are more about funding the person than the idea, right? You don't have, generally in a lot of fellowships, you don't have a lot of money to actually implement a grand scientific idea. Standard scientific applications typically need to really clearly articulate why this is innovative, why the idea is significant, and proceeds logically from prior work. It's usually an incremental step, but important step in science. The moonshot applications are an application that, if successful, would fundamentally reshape a policy, a disease, treatment, and so on. These are much rarer and usually have much larger budgets. So in conclusion here, you should learn from mistakes and successes. Everybody has grants that don't get funded. I've had plenty of them that do not get funded. When you don't get funded, you can be upset for a few days, but then consider yourself in the company of every other scientist in the field. What this talk should be making clear to you is describing the science is really only half the battle. The other half is persistence and grantsmanship. Just because you get a poor review doesn't necessarily mean that your idea is bad. It may mean that you just need to craft the language differently. Grantsmanship plays a very large role in obtaining a grant. So do not get angry, or you can get angry for a few days, but then don't get angry. Try to learn from the comments. After you get a grant not funded, or as you're putting together your own grant, think about how did a successful grant application format that particular successful grant? What language did they use? What key terms did they use in their successful grant application? Get help from colleagues who've been successful to get grants. Get that help, and get that help generally weeks before. That help can really be beneficial. Don't take it personally. Think about the reviewers. If a reviewer or a reader is getting confused about a sentence or about a paragraph or about an area or about an idea, don't take that personally, but think about how can I reshape my grant to make it more clear? So, thank you very much. And I hope that this has been informative for you in constructing your own grant applications. Again, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or if I could be of any further help. Thank you.
No, ponte la cámara.
Well, thank you very much, Kirk. That was a really, really nice presentation, and fun and educative and everything. I learned a lot, actually.
You have here from the...
Oh, good.
Great. The question. So,
Okay.
si alguien tiene una pregunta o quiere hacerle alguna... No sé, ahora con el profesor Kirk, tenéis ahora la oportunidad. Podría ser si queréis las preguntas también en español, y aquí está Fran y se las traduce a Kirk al inglés, ¿vale?
Vale. Vamos a ir leyendo, a ver si ponéis preguntas por aquí.
No
en
se me
español o en
pregunta
inglés.
mucho, pero venga a preguntar pues.
Thank you, very informative. People are happy. You have 80 something people.
Oh, great,
So
great.
it's really good. Thanks.
Very positive. Bueno, no hemos dicho nada, pero los que estéis aquí en la sala también podéis preguntar. Pero es que nos acostumbramos tanto al formato virtual que ya ignoramos a la gente que está en la sala.
Hola, me llamo Ana. ¿Puedo hacer una pregunta? ¿En inglés?
Bueno, ahí tenemos...
Sí.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very useful. Sometimes it's difficult to obtain grants for investigate a project about the social science because we investigate in a context specific, very specific. And things that is very important for employers,
For funding agencies, yeah.
what is good tips for applicate is better in context specific or do the presentation more balance?
Yeah. I think that so I've read and reviewed quite a few grants from various social science areas, not just from the psychological or brain sciences, but from social sciences as well. And you're absolutely right. Sometimes, and even I don't think it's just your area as well. There's I think a lot of very good biological research that often gets criticized because it's unclear what the next step. Even if we identify this particular molecule as mediating some outcome in a cell model, it's sometimes unclear what the bigger picture is. What is this going to really resolve in our understanding? And that's opens up the door for potential criticism from reviewers. I would recommend that kind of the same language and grantsmanship that I was describing here really indicate not only the scientific impact, but also the potential broader impact. How is this going to impact the field of, let's say you're doing sociology work, How is it going to impact the field of sociology? Is it going to change or alter the way we think about a particular theory within sociological research? Could it potentially have, is there a way of thinking about social problems that might be impacted by this particular research? It may not be direct, right? It may not be that this result from this research will then directly lead to this policy change, but if there is a link, highlight that. This result could change or could result in some policy implications or policy changes. So significance and innovation and relevance, I think, is a challenge for many fields, and it is very important to pinpoint and really highlight for the reviewer, for this field this is important, but also on a broader perspective this is important. And you can use words like I said, transform or cost effective or far-reaching implications, and really make it very specific so that the reviewer doesn't have to be grasping for why this is significant. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Kirk, one question. And you pointed a lot of important things to consider when applying for research. If you have to do your top 3 or top 5 most common mistakes in the application you are reviewing, could you just that we all review that we don't make them?
Sure, yeah. I think it's a great question. One thing that I often see, especially from junior investigators, people just recently submitting grants, is that they try to be too ambitious. And so what I mean by that is that they have an idea of their 5 or 10 year research plan, and they're trying to squeeze it all into one grant application. And not only does it become unwieldy, it's too difficult to then understand the theory, the justifications, how everything gets linked together. But then also reviewers start to question feasibility. Can all of this actually be done in this one grant? So don't think that you can go in, or that you should go in answering all the questions there is in your field. No reviewer, no scientist answer all the world's problems. So be direct, have explicit direct aims, hypotheses. Don't be overly ambitious. So I see that as one mistake that often gets criticized quite a bit. Another one is one that I mentioned, and that is not really directly highlighting what the gaps in knowledge are. And so when I go in and it's unclear to me what is actually still necessary in this field, why is this aim and hypothesis being proposed, the grant has basically failed at that point, right? If I'm as a reviewer really what has been done and what hasn't been done, and what is the importance of this stuff that hasn't been done yet, then you're kind of lost. And so I see a lot of grants failing because simply because they just haven't highlighted what the gaps actually are. So that's another major problem. I think that another major problem is coming back to the question earlier, is the significance in innovation. I think that a lot of times people have some sense of the significance in innovation, but they're either they have their lens focused too narrowly on their field, or they have a very broad focus and aren't really thinking about their particular project and how these results will impact the field. And this needs to be very clearly articulated. And again, as a reviewer, I have limited time. So I don't want to be writing my review and my critique, trying to come up with this potential significance on my own. I want the reviewer, or I want the grant writer to tell me what is significant about this application. Makes my job a lot easier as well as a reviewer. So I see that as another major problem. Now, probably the last one that I think hurts is one of the points that I brought up as well is developing the methodology. I went through that point a little bit more quickly because it was more about the science, and every science is different. So I didn't want to be standing up here giving a lot of science, but there's many ways of talking about our science. And if I'm getting an application, I don't necessarily know what are the best techniques in this area or the best approaches, the common experimental designs, the pitfalls, the challenges that people face to do the science. I don't know this necessarily as a reviewer, but I can, if I'm starting to make inferences based on your methodology and your approach, or questioning whether the make could be inferred based on your particular design, then that's a potential problem. So make sure that you articulate what are the pitfalls and why aren't they a major problem for this particular grant application? Why did you choose the sample that you chose? Why are you doing this in mice instead of rats? Why are you doing this in older adult humans instead of middle-aged humans? Why are you, so all of these questions should be very clear. And sometimes if it's not clear, down a hole of questioning, and then they highlight this as a potential weakness because it's unclear why this grant is focused on this thing. So I would say probably those are the key spots where I see a lot of grants fail.
Thank you very much.
You have the question in the chat?
Yeah, I will read that. So I think because we are running over time, I think maybe Danny, this can be last question. I would read one question about the ERC applicant. You can see here, he felt that the reviewers, based on the reviewer feedback, they were not expert in their field. So the challenge he asked, he or she asked, how do I compress in 10 pages the background that they don't have and still, highlight the innovative part of the application, and how to balance their ignorance in the field and the complex and innovative aspect of the grant application.
This is, spoke earlier about balancing what is known versus what is unknown is exactly this issue, right? So it's an extremely difficult thing to do, to balance all of this. And by balancing, I don't just mean balancing all the language, it's balancing how many pages you have to actually write all of this and get your point across with what is clearly known in the field and what is the gap in knowledge. So using some of the tips that I showed earlier with framing sentences, some sentences you can clearly articulate, we know this, this, and this, and then provide citations. There's sometimes I even explicitly state that methodologies. Our group has a significant amount of experience conducting similar clinical trials and neuroimaging methodology. See this whole list of citations if you want to see more on this. Reviewers are also scientists. They understand that it's very difficult. Most of them should understand it's very difficult to squeeze everything in to 10 pages, or sometimes even less. Some grants in NIH are 6 pages. Very, very difficult to squeeze everything in that you want to say in this amount of space. So it is a balancing act, and it's very difficult. And that's why quite often I will go through word by word, sentence by sentence. Is this the word that I want to indicate? What is my point from the sentence? A lot of times I go through with a scalpel. This is good information to have, but it's not relevant for the reviewers to really understand the main point. And so sometimes the background, they just need to know enough of the background to feel confident about what is known and what is unknown. So if you go on for a lot of pages about what is known, it's not really helping your case that much. If you're only leaving a little bit for what is unknown, that's not helpful either. And so give them enough information so that they can understand where your hypotheses are coming from, but then you don't necessarily have to give them every study that's ever been done. You don't necessarily have to give them every problem in the area. Have them and guide them to your sense for why this field is going to benefit from this grant application. So I agree with you. It's very, very difficult to do. We still struggle and we still spend a lot of time. And this is why, grants take months and months, if not years, to actually complete.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, actually, you talk about 10 pages, but it's true, the ERC grants have 2 steps. First step is actually just 5 pages, and they are general panelists on a very broad area. So that is a challenge. But
It is,
it's
yeah.
the same rules for everybody, right?
Yep.
So everybody have 5 pages to convince, so that's the same challenge for everybody. And then if you pass to step 2, then you get expert evaluators, hopefully, because then they send for external reviewers.
Yeah.
That can be more specific with the topic. But yeah, that's the rules of the
And
game.
even sometimes those, their reviewers are sometimes a little bit more specific in your area, but that still doesn't mean that they know the literature in your area like you do, right? So in my area, it might be somebody who is familiar with cognitive aging. That's their expertise, but they don't really know my area. They aren't familiar with the challenges, how the field has progressed and stuff. And so it still can sometimes be a challenge, even with these more knowledgeable reviewers, balancing and convincing them, this is what we know, this is what we don't know. It's tough.
Thank you very much, Danny. So we
Okay.
close the session.
Okay, so we can finish the session, okay? Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your presentation. I see you had a lot of experience, so maybe it could be very useful for the presentation for the people. So thank you very much. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Feliz fiesta, Merry Christmas to the people here in the room. Also, también feliz Navidad para la gente que está ahí por ahí. Vale, estoy hablando de Daniel Torre, aunque no me veáis. Felices fiestas, cerramos con este curso. Este año yo sigo publicando, que lamentablemente va a terminar como terminan todos los años, peor que el año pasado. En fin, pensábamos que lo de los cursos virtuales iba a acabar, pero me parece que va a ir para largo, o sea que tenemos larga vida aquí, yo sigo publicando. Nada, descansar y felices fiestas. No digo nada más. Yo vengo luchando los cursos a través del grupo de Telegram. Un abrazo.
Adiós, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Sergio.
Adios, everyone.